Okay, I had started recording and then I stopped recording, but we'll just restart real quick. And all I said was this was the book we were reading and it was unhelpful because this is backwards. So when you look at the video, that won't help at all. But C.S. Lewis is out of the Silent Planet, and that this is the first novel that we have read in some time. And so one of the tricky things has revealed itself to be how much of a novel do you read before you stop to talk about it? And I will say, I assumed, because it's been many years since I've read this. Okay, well, let's read the first couple of chapters. That should be enough to talk about. And it was very short. So in order to have something to actually talk about, we may, for at least a little while, need to take a few more chapters at once. We had a couple of eager beavers who have already finished, I think, right? No?
No.
Oh, I thought you guys just said that you did. Anyway, so that's fine. But we may look at multiple chapters because most of them are pretty short. And if we've been used to reading Dr. Brand's book, which might have 13, 14 relatively dense pages in one chapter, that we might do 3, 4, even 5 of these chapters. That many of them are only like 2.5, 3 pages, and it moves pretty quick. But just so we have more of the story to chew on when we come back together, we'll look at maybe a great big chunk for next time. But I want to thank you for taking a risk on this because it is so very, very different than we have been doing through our last book, which, because of the pandemic, went on for forever. But it was great. I mean, it was such a very, very good book that even though it lasted for a long time, I think we were all probably kind of a little sorry that it ended. And this is just going to be kind of a completely different change of pace. Obviously being a novel, being a fiction work, with a story that's kind of snappy and moves, it's going to be real different, but there's still going to be stuff for us to talk about, maybe less today. And I'll apologize for saying there's not a lot to dig into in these first couple of chapters. So let me reverse just a little to give us something kind of constructive in this first session. To recap a little bit about where this is coming from, and I've mentioned it a few times that C.S. Lewis, who has written quite a bit, and we've read several of his books together over the years. This is one of his more rare adult novels, which he doesn't have a lot of. But C.S. Lewis, who was an Oxford Don, that is a university instructor for quite a long time, and then eventually took a similar position in Cambridge. His specialty was medieval literature. He was one of the foremost experts in the world on 15th century English literature. He was a guy who, he knew a lot about a lot. We often think of him for his works in apologetics and Christian theology, Christian living and discipleship. He became famous really in doing his radio broadcasts over the BBC, reading his book, chapter by chapter, Mere Christianity, during the early days of World War II. That kind of gave him a huge national audience that grew international as these books started to get published all over the world. Most famous, presumably, for his Chronicles of Narnia children's fantasy series. But, at his heart, C.S. Lewis was an academic, was, one of the most brilliant men in the world, one of the best educated men in the world. And some of those opportunities brought him in contact with other like-minded luminaries. One of them, J.R.R. Tolkien of the Lord of the Rings fame. So they both worked together, taught together at Oxford for a number of years. They met when they were relatively newly back from World War I. There on the campus of Oxford, and they hit it off. Them and a few other folks whose somewhat informal group meetings kind of became the stuff of legends, meeting at the same old pub all the time and talking great literary thoughts, and then reading each other's works to each other, and then making fun of each other and goofing around and being both incredibly witty and incredibly silly in that sort of way that I think, you know, only smart British people can pull off. It was J.R.R. Tolkien who was one of the folks instrumental in leading C.S. Lewis back to faith in Christ. C.S. Lewis, who had lost his childhood faith after the death of his mother through cancer. It was these guys who he was spending time with in Oxford, who eventually, through argument, really, helped him rediscover his faith and grow into the man who wrote and who spoke in such a way that has made a compelling case for Christ now for decades all over the world. One of the things they like to do at this group, the Inklings, they call themselves, is they would share their own works. All of them were kind of working on something all the time: essays, poetry, novels, books, whatever it might be. And they would read into each other, and they would mostly offer valid critique and occasionally just rip each other apart for the sheer fun of it. And Lewis and Tolkien in particular used to be at odds constantly, in a well-meaning, well-spirited way, but really kind of rip each other to shreds about how stupid or boring or crazy their individual works were. But they really kind of honed and shaped each other into being sharper than they would have been on their own. This work itself comes really directly from that relationship in what's referred to as the wager. So after many years of, you know, hearing each other's work and getting kind of bored at the sort of stuff that the respective authors tended to write about, they challenged each other with needing to write a book completely outside of your normal genre. And so this wager was, you know, who can write supposedly the best novel, but it had to be completely different than the sort of stuff they had been writing about. So Tolkien could not write about Middle-earth and elves and write his very lengthy poetry, and C.S. Lewis could not write about talking animals in Narnia, and he couldn't write Christian apologetics, and it could not be a fantasy work. So they decided, I don't know if somebody did it for him, I kind of forget the story, but C.S. Lewis would have to write a science fiction novel, which seemed to be really different than the stuff he'd been writing before, be real stretched. And Tolkien was supposed to write a time travel novel. And this was just kind of a fun exercise to challenge themselves and each other. Tolkien's time travel novel was never finished. Bits and pieces of it exist that his son Christopher Tolkien, who edited and posthumously published a lot of Tolkien's work, he had the papers for. I think in part it might have been published along with something else, because it never got very far. But Lewis wrote this book, Out of the Silent Planet, as his end of the wager, which I suppose you could say he won, because he actually finished and Tolkien didn't. And he went on from that to turn it into a trilogy. What is kind of especially fascinating about this book that you may not get without some of this background is one of the reasons why it was so unusual, really incongruous for C.S. Lewis to write science fiction is that we're talking about writing in the 50s, and there's plenty of science fiction in the 50s, but it's all very technology based. And you know, with him being born, you know, near the end of the 19th century, you know, he's seen that this huge technological advancement. He lived and served through World War I, and you know, mechanized warfare and kind of the end product of the Industrial Revolution. He would have been very familiar with the works of somebody like H.G. Wells, who he didn't particularly care for. And so the thought of science fiction, which was kind of starting to become a legitimate genre in the 50s in particular, had a very modern scientific feel and flavor to it. The technological advances that now, with our own, you know, increasingly powerful telescopes and our, you know, increasingly complicated mathematical formulas deriving through astrophysics, we're, you know, feeling like we're getting closer and closer to understanding the concept of space, outer space, and other planets and other worlds. And so all of that would kind of not particularly appeal to Lewis, who saw modernity as a whole with kind of a dubious eye, and our ability to reduce everything to scientific formulas as basically a short-sighted mistake. One of the best phrases to capture Lewis's fundamental take on seeing outer space as a function of telescopes and physics formulas would come from a little moment that happens near the end of one of his Narnia books, Voyage of the Dawn Treader. And in that book, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, one of the children from Earth on a faraway, distant island meets a person who's best described as a retired star. He was a star in the sky whose job it was is to offer light in the darkness, and to travel throughout what we would consider space to countless ages of humanity, and had now kind of taken his rest. And so the human child in our world was really fascinated by this. He said, "Well, that's so different than my world, because in my world, a star is a flaming ball of gas." And this retired star from Narnia said, "Child, even in your world, that's what a star was made of, but not what a star is." That would encapsulate Lewis's concept of reducing things to a simple scientific formula can miss what they truly are, as though concepts like love could be reduced to a chemical formula. It can't. Freedom, anger, hope, those are more than numbers. Those are more than chemicals. Those are more than physical processes. But the kind of modern scientific approach to trying to reduce everything down to cells or atoms or math, it can describe something very well and still miss the forest for the trees and not understand what that thing is. So when he says a star is more than a ball of flaming gas, that might surprise us to say, well, but that's what it is, right? Well, yes and no. Aren't stars more than just what they're composed of? We use them for navigation. We look at them and we see beauty or maybe hope. If you've ever been in a place far away from civilization and lights, and you see the stars above you on a dark night, it's more than a ball of flaming gas. It speaks to your soul somehow. We see something that's profound and powerful and beautiful. And stars from the beginning of humanity have meant more than the process of astrophysics that governs how they operate. We've written poetry. We've painted great paintings. We've been inspired to search and to strive, all because of those flaming balls of gas, which are more than just flaming balls of gas. So Lewis at his heart was a medievalist. And so when he talks about space that we're going to encounter here, believe it or not, if you don't see in these first two chapters, sorry about that, he really means the medieval concept of the heavens. So for time immemorial, people would look up and they would gaze and they would see that starry sky and talk about the heavens. And that doesn't just mean like, oh, one of those stars is an angel, or one of those stars, that's where the throne of God is. Beyond that, it's just more about seeing not a vacuum, an expanse of nothingness, but that even the concept of space had a fullness of the presence of God. And so that's the guy who is now writing a science fiction story about a journey to another planet. It's both, completely unpredictable that such a person would write a story like that, but it's also going to be full of a lot of deeply interesting concepts that we don't tend to think about so much anymore. How would that work in real life? Or, he's kind of not quite so interested in describing the physical mechanisms that make this science fiction work possible. And you read a lot of science fiction, you watch a lot of science fiction, and it's all technology, technology, technology. There will be some technology in here, but it's almost incidental to the story. He will describe it not as somebody who could build that same machine, but as somebody who's looking at something kind of incomprehensible and doing his best to describe what he sees. It's not about the flashing lights. It's not about the tunneling neutrinos or tachyon field. It's more about someone who is very much out of his element. As a philologist, not as an astrophysicist, and discovering what, not just a new planet, but a new world. We're so constrained in understanding everything by our own perspective. We are the fish that doesn't know that it's wet, because all we know is being in water. So how do you understand life in a context that is completely foreign to ours? Not just different in the sense of every Star Trek alien is a human that has ridges somewhere on their head or on their nose, or they might have a different color. But like, what happens when life itself just doesn't fit into our understanding? So here's the other little tidbit that you wouldn't necessarily understand without context. We are introduced in these first two chapters to the main character. Anybody remember his name?
Ransom.
Ransom. Ransom. Elwyn Ransom.
Yeah.
And he is an academic. He is a Don, described as a Cambridge Don, who is on holiday. It's in between terms, and he's off on a walking tour. We get a very limited physical description of him, but it's there. Do anybody remember what his academic discipline was? He was a philologist, which we'll talk about in a second. I'm going to unpack this. So, but here's the thing. This guy is Tolkien. So he wrote the book, like in the challenge, C.S. Lewis wrote the book and he made the main character look and sound and act exactly like his friend who had challenged him to write the book in the first place. Tolkien looked like this, acted like this, and was a philologist. It's a tricky one. It is a tricky one. So anyway, that's just kind of a fun little thing that in their own works, they wind up including each other in their in the representations. Now, Ransom is a very clear insert of Tolkien. There's a less clear, it's more subtle, but there's definitely an inspiration of Lewis in Tolkien's work. And that is in the person of Bilbo Baggins the Hobbit. So if you ever come across the book again, or you read through it, or you watch the movie, understand that a lot of the personality that Tolkien gave Bilbo was sort of poking at his friend, C.S. Lewis. So anyway, that's kind of the outside of the book background that I thought might be helpful in putting some of these pieces together. All right, so let's go ahead and dig in and see what we can get out of the 2 quick chapters that not a ton happens in. We start off, and we are basically in the English countryside, and we are with Ransom. And what's Ransom doing? Walking. Now, this is a particularly English sort of thing to do. Has anyone taken a walking tour? And I don't mean of like a place. I mean, that's what you did.
No.
That's no vacation.
It's very English, especially of this time period and of academics. But that would be like a vacation. Something that might be vaguely similar here in the States would be, and I'm assuming none of us have done it, I haven't done it, but if you've ever known anyone who's hiked the Appalachian Trail. So that's a thing that people do. And the Appalachian, it's 1,000 miles long, and people, very few people hike the whole trail, but you might take a couple of weeks and you do a portion of it, and people have been doing that for decades. Canada has trails, okay. Also, in other places in Europe, there are often pilgrimages. The El Camino in Spain. There's several of these in England. The Canterbury Trail. The English like to take their long country strolls, and so imagine your vacation was planning out a walking trip of a couple of weeks. You might take out a big map. You might see which cities or towns had an inn or a pub, and kind of plan out, well, one day I'm going to walk from here to here. And the next day I'm going to have to go from here to this other town. And well, this one's going to be a hard walking day because I have to walk a little further. This one's going to be real leisurely. Oh, this one's going to pass by that little quaint church. This one's going to pass by that river. But that would be how they might spend a couple of weeks even. You would just go, you would take your pack or your sack or whatever, and maybe you went with multiple people, or maybe you just went by yourself. But you would walk for multiple hours in a day, and you would kind of plan out a tour where you walked from town to town, stayed overnight in some probably kind of random accommodation, and then you went on until you were done. Can you see the charm in that?
Not as a Floridian.
Not as a Floridian, I agree. I wouldn't do it.
Adventurous.
It is. There is something, kind of kind of attractive about that spirit that says, I'm gonna go off. It's not into the unknown, but it's, you know, you're gonna go off by yourself and you're gonna take these trails or paths or through the woods or whatever it might be. And I'm a little reminded of, if you remember the movie Forrest Gump,
Yes.
that when Jenny leaves and he feels like this huge kind of missing piece in his life, and so he starts to run. And he runs across the country like 3 or 4 times, and people start following him. Well, ostensibly, you know, you're not just like running 24 hours a day, nor are you falling asleep on the side of the road, but you run and you stop somewhere, kind of randomly, but then you. It would also be, if anyone has ever heard of folks who take Route 66. Like you can take the Mother Road, they call it, and stop at like old time diners and old time roadside attractions, and you know, feel like you're kind of on that meandering path. So we have ways of kind of relating to that, but some of this is just sort of foreign. So anyway, so Ellen Ransom is he's out walking, and the whole story kind of hinges on a single decision. What's the decision? It's early on. It's kind of not, I mean, it might not feel like a singular moment, but there's a circumstance that happens early on that sort of changes everything else. Not quite to the boy. You have to almost back up.
He gets refused accommodations.
Yeah, his plan kind of doesn't work. So he gets sort of stuck. He had sort of planned out one of these day trips, and it didn't work out for some reason. And so he's kind of at a halfway point. I can go back to where I know there's a place to stay, or I can push further than I really want to, because I know there's another place further out and I'm not sure there's anything in between. So if that kind of slid past you as being kind of inconsequential, I mean, it is, but in essence, it isn't.
No.
Because I mean, imagine if he had just gone back to where he was, none of this story happens at all. So he has to make the decision. Plan B is to push on and go a little further than I want to. Maybe there's something that I need to be prepared to go a little harder and faster and longer today than I wanted to. And so that's kind of that's sort of the circumstances that we start off with. So he makes the decision to go ahead and push on further. And I don't know if you've ever done this, where you start walking and then you realize if you don't pick up the pace, it's going to be a much worse walk than you realize. And so you start, instead of a leisurely walk, it turns into kind of a hard walk. And then that's when he starts this story with the lady. So who wants to catch us up about the lady?
Who wants to catch himself about the lake?
The lady.
Well, he sees a light and goes to the house, and a lady comes running out. She's upset about her boy who hasn't come home.
Right.
And it's late and he should have been home by now. And then we find out he's not super bright and kind of needs to be looked out after.
Yeah.
So she says he works down the street a bit at the Rise, and there are 2 men there that her son Harry, it's Harry I think, works for, and would she, you know, he offers to go and stop there, thinking that maybe I can stay overnight there. and get Harry on his way. So he ends up walking a little further to the rise.
We're good. Yeah, so Harry, you might not be the sharpest tool. He kind of gives the impression the woman isn't either, but she's very upset. She's very clearly upset. She's very worried. And so, Ransom could have very easily just, not my problem. She confirms there's nowhere else to go but this faraway town that he's already starting to wonder how hard it's going to be to get there. Or this place, the Rise. Now this is just a private home. But we've got, if plan B of walking further to the next town is getting less and less attractive, what's the plan C Ransom is starting to formulate?
Got my phone. Oh, just push it.
Yeah, he's gonna take a chance to see if he can find lodgings, but now that he's met this woman and heard her story about Harry, he has kind of a kernel of a plan starting to form that involves the son. So
Tell him that one of the men was a professor.
she may have, yeah, I think so.
Yeah, and that would kind of give him a connection and think, he's.
I don't know if he was a professor, but he was a schoolmate. They knew each other in
He doesn't know
school.
who it is yet, I think. Right, or let's see.
He hasn't met him
Did
yet.
she use the guy's name and did you recognize it?
There were two men, Mr. Devine.
Right. But does she mention that? Does she mention?
Yes.
She did.
Oh, okay. So he starts to formulate a plan like, okay, this lady's really upset. I'm not sure I want to help, but she is very upset, so I guess I probably should. However, I can solve my problem too. Because if I go and I solve the Harry problem and send him home, well, maybe wink, wink, nudge, nudge, nod, nod, show the old school colors. These guys are getting a place to stay. He doesn't know them. Now it does turn out that he does know one of the guys. But this is the plan where now, instead of facing kind of a real crummy, hard walk into the night, he's almost a little cheerful. Like, oh, problem solved. I will do a good turn and I will find a place to stay. Bravo to me. So he gets there and he does figure out what the Rise is because there's kind of no mistaking it. How would you describe this, kind of estate?
Looked kind of neglected.
Yeah.
Having trouble understanding
Yeah.
him too.
Forebode.
Whatever plan he had about this is going to be some old chums who are going to give me a nice place to stay. He actually gets to the place and it's already kind of creepy. And he's kind of starting to doubt how good of an idea this is. Sort of ramshackle, sort of overgrown. There's a closed, locked gate. How does he get in? It's not welcoming at all.
Cross through the hedge.
Yeah, he's got to crawl through a hedge, toss his backpack over the gate, and then kind of squeeze and crawl his way through an overgrown hedge. So already this is way more trouble than I think was in his mind.
You can't make out his marks.
But he's a man of his word. He promised the lady that he would get her
Yeah,
son.
now he's kind of stuck. Scout's honor, he's made a promise that I think he regrets. But he sort of feels like he needs to see it through. So now getting through the hedge and seeing the buildings,
Better.
Sure.
now how does it strike you? What kind of place is this?
Worse.
Yeah, Lila's feeling evil.
There was smoke coming up from behind the house, which I was puzzled.
Okay, smoke from behind the house, why behind the house? That's kind of puzzling. No lights,
You rang the bell and you didn't get any response.
right? So, everything seems inhospitable, everything seems dark, everything seems run down, everything seems like this might have been a beautiful estate at some point, but now between time, disrepair, and just sort of a weird atmosphere, something just very foreboding about the whole place. And so he definitely would have left if he hadn't made that promise. But, you know, in for a penny, in for a pound. So he's ringing bells and banging on doors and stuff. And how does he first find out that there are other people there?
He heard a noise, a scuffle.
There's a scuffle.
Yeah.
That's not a great start. You're already in a place that seems kind of creepy. No one's answering, but when you finally do get around where you think people are, it sounds like there's a fight going on. And I don't know if you have ever went to knock on a door and you can hear arguing. It's the worst feeling.
Yeah.
So,
And the fun part, the boy was saying he wanted to go home. Well,
that's right. So now he finally kind of sort of blunders into this scene. We've got the boy, we've got these two other men. What's going on?
They're trying to get him to go into this building
Yeah.
and he doesn't want to go.
Well, he's fighting. He's fighting.
let me go home.
And he, you know, I want to go home and I don't want to go in there anymore. And poor Ransom, all he can kind of do is, I say, oh, Jeps, or you know, whatever. And it's really kind of weeny, pathetic, sort of, but it does just enough to interrupt things.
And they were startled to see him.
I think that confrontation should have alerted Ransom that, hey, something's not right here.
Yeah,
Here's
absolutely.
these two people trying to force this young man into a chamber that he doesn't want to go into. Apparently has been there before, doesn't like it,
Right.
and they're using force. I would think that Ransom would have said, hey, what's going on here? But he slips into a very friendly relationship with his earlier schoolmate, and apparently doesn't think anything odd about the situation. That was the first thing that has hit me in reading the book, that
Yeah.
this isn't normal. This isn't natural.
Anyone have a thought on that?
I think Ransom was, he says that he was so tired that the idea of resting and having a drink kind of made him bypass any questions that he had about the situation.
Well, I don't know. If I walk down the street and see two people trying to force somebody into something that individual doesn't want to go,
Sure.
I-
Yeah, so imagine that.
I think I'd have some kind of a reaction.
You know, let's say we're in kind of an isolated part of town and we see a couple of guys trying to push another guy into a car. I don't want to go. I don't want to go. I don't want to go. Now, immediately, that would be, wait a second. And if we say something, well, yeah, but here's the thing where I mean, I think, Tom, you're absolutely right, except I think that they give him an explanation. And regardless of how plausible that explanation is, I think Ransom sort of wants to believe it. You see people trying to shove somebody into a car. You know, wait a second. Like, oh, well, he's very sick and we've got to take him to the doctor and he knows he's going to get a shot, but he has to go or else he's going to die. And then, oh, I see. It's kind of like seeing a child scream in a store. And part of you has to think, oh my gosh, this poor child, there's something wrong. But sometimes there is a completely legitimate reason, and that the kid's being a brat or whatever it is. The parents are not in the wrong. And I think Ransom just, it doesn't quite dawn on him that people like him, academics and professors, could be mixed up in something so bad. He wants to believe that there is a reasonable explanation, and they give him one. What is it?
To just go in the bathroom and get washed up.
Yeah, this kid is all work. He's got problems, which Ransom has already pretty much figured out. The kid's kind of slow. He might have other mental problems, and sometimes he gets worked up, and it's a real problem. And he could cause trouble at home. So when that happens, they just put him in this quiet room, they clean him up, he calms down after a few minutes, and then he can go home. And that doesn't stand up to much scrutiny, but I will say, I think Ransom just sort of wants there to be a simple explanation. And when you want there to be a simple explanation, sometimes you can find it.
And didn't his mom sort of imply that he was a little slower, so that might have kind of lended credence to the
Yeah,
conversation?
absolutely. I think something does say, I think she does mention something about that. And so Ransom's already kind of thinking that, that this kid is not, all there. And so even though the scene looks bad, he can rationalize it with this explanation that the other guys give.
Maybe even inspire that he could take the boy home.
Right. And so they even say like, oh, we're just going to calm him down. Oh, you're probably real tired. While he's calming down, why don't we get you a drink and then you can take him home. So it's sort of, just enough to allay the fears. And even though Tom is still right that, the radar should have picked this up. Your spider sense should be tingling if this is something wrong anyway. But I will say, if we always acted on those impulses, then con men would never be successful ever. Which obviously they are all the time.
I think the author's intent introducing this situation is to suggest to the reader that, hey, there's something wrong here. This is not a normal situation. It sort of builds up in the reader a curiosity of what's going to happen next.
Sure.
Yeah,
I think it's also doing a little bit of like when you see a scary movie and you start shouting at the character to don't go down into the basement like an idiot.
Yeah.
That I think he's presenting Ransom in such a way that we are more worried for him than he is. He should see what's going on, but between him being tired, maybe being a little trusting, maybe just not even fathoming that people would do something like this. I mean, does anyone really expect to get kidnapped? That just seems outlandish. That's something that happens in a movie. It doesn't happen in your real life. But as our 2 chapters end, that's exactly what's going to happen. These guys actually, it's all a lie. They are not giving him a drink so that he can be refreshed and take this kid home. So let's go back to.
He knew Divine at school.
Yes.
And they talked about what kind of impression he had.
Right. So what does Ransom think of Divine?
Yeah.
He doesn't like Divine.
No.
So if you had to describe what kind of person you think Divine is like, how might you do that? Con man?
Crude,
Crude?
overly confident in his own abilities.
Yeah.
Arrogant. Yeah.
Yeah. I have the word smarmy in my mind.
That's a good one.
That he's one of those smug people who is just kind of breezing through things and, Ransom describes him in school as being someone who was kind of briefly popular because he was snarky before that was cool. And the other kids just thought, oh, he's really something. He's so confident. But just always kind of empty. That once you got past the snark, he was just kind of an unpleasant, empty person. Definitely no compassion.
And he said he was puzzled at his success and increasing wealth.
Right.
Doesn't sound good.
Yeah, like, why is this guy successful? He just doesn't, he seems to be like smoke and mirrors. So Divine, however, seems to have done very well for himself, at least financially. And we get some references about how he's been using his money, investing in this project that he's got this other collaborator on. And this is the collaborator, Weston. So what's Weston like?
Rough,
Weston is rough.
yeah. And he's very focused on whatever this project is, and he doesn't care about the niceties of
Right.
getting along with people or anything else.
Now, yeah, well, he's just, everything that he says and does is so blunt. When Ransom needs to get out of here, but then Divine kind of is talking him into it. But even then, everything that Weston does or says feels almost kind of brutish, which is interesting to me. What does Weston do?
Physicist, isn't it?
Yeah, he's a physicist, and apparently an exceptionally high level physicist. And I kind of don't know exactly what to make of that. When I think of someone like at the peak of an academic profession, we kind of naturally assume they're going to be very, very refined. Their intelligence, which must be very high, will be manifest in the way that they speak or act. And Weston seems real aggressive and rough.
Mhm.
So how do we put that together? How do we put his rough mannerisms with his apparently exceptional intellect and training?
Seems like Divine is kind of the face to the outer world of whatever this project is.
Right.
Not only the money, but if it has to be negotiated in any way, Divine has just enough charisma, sort of.
Yeah, sort of the guy that you would expect at the cocktail party to talk up the great idea.
Yeah.
But then Weston is maybe like not good with people, but just good with ideas. Anything else? There's kind of a funny, I think this is D.L. Moody, the Baptist preacher from the turn of the century, but he was talking about the value of education, and basically saying the push for more and more education to solve society's problems was wrong. That you can educate someone, but it doesn't make them better as a person. He says, if you take a child who has been something like stealing cinders off of a railroad track, and you take him to school and give him the finest of education, you're going to turn him into somebody who will learn how to steal the whole railroad. So the idea being, it's become kind of a common sense aphorism that you solve a problem in culture, society through education, but if that education doesn't have a moral component, you can be a very well-educated, terrible person. And having PhD at the end of your name doesn't make you good. And so that's kind of where I'm sort of thinking the characterization of Weston is going. In general, he's just probably not good with people. He's probably just, you know, one of those zero social skills, smart people. But maybe there's also a little bit of, you know, if Divine is kind of an empty suit, he's all flash and no substance. Weston already might have some substance, but it's not very pleasant substance. Does that seem fair? All right, so what next?
They give him the drink, but he's been waiting.
Yes, and we start getting a little, the vaguest hints of what's going on. What sort of explanation do they give him about what they're up to? Well, he calls them that Divine says that Weston is his colleague. And so he implies there's some kind of project.
Mm-hmm.
So what does he say about the project? It's not much. Very vague. Okay, there's a laboratory, there's ongoing scientific work happening. And basically it's so advanced that it takes someone with the singular talent of Weston to do it. So whatever it is, it's super sophisticated, it's ongoing, and Weston seems to be one of the few people in the world who can pull it off. Did you catch anything else about Divine's part in this? Like, I don't get the sense that the Divine's background is in physics. So why would he care? He's sort of roundabout with it, and sort of offhanded, but he gives us a clue about what Divine is interested in. Weston seems to be interested in the experiment itself. Divine has a different interest. He refers to the commercial possibilities. I think Divine is in this to make a buck.
Mm-hmm.
And he sees that Weston has an idea that is so different that nobody else is doing it, but it can be developed and make money. So we're already kind of seeing the two different motivations of these supposed colleagues. So Rankin gets the drink, he starts getting some kind of explanation from Divine, and then what happens?
Apparently they experimented on their dog and they no longer have a dog.
True. But do they tell that to Ransom, or does Ransom kind of pick that up?
No, he picks that up because they're talking about how he got in to how Ransom got into the property. And so, well, if we had a dog, that would have protected us. And well, we had one, but don't anymore.
Yeah, which is already kind of creepy.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah. And then because the dog's gone, they're gonna use Harry. So,
Right. Now, I'm not sure, tell me if I'm wrong, I'm not sure they tell Ransom these things, but Ransom overhears them because that wasn't a drink that Ransom got. They drank it. So I want to say that the information about the dog and about Harry is Divine and Weston talking to each other and not realizing that Ransom has sort of vaguely kind of come around. So they have taken the opportunity to sucker him in and drug him to sleep. And these guys who have experimented and ostensibly killed a dog and have been doing who knows what to this boy have now decided that Ransom is somehow a more suitable candidate.
oh, definitely, yeah.
First of all, why do you think he's more suitable?
He has no family. He's on this walking tour with
Yeah.
no specific beginning or end or intermediate addresses. Nobody's gonna miss him for a long time, if ever. Yeah, he's definitely fits the bill.
It's kind of a perfect disposable person.
Mhm.
No one will check in on. And if he disappears, it'll be months before anyone even questions it. And even then, they may never bother. But what's also good about Ransom that's maybe better than a dog or better than Harry?
He's human, whereas they referred to Harry as a preparation. So apparently, for whatever mission they have, they kind of need someone who is capable of thought.
Right. So they at least Divine is trying to sort of recommend Ransom might be helpful in their endeavor. Weston, who seems less interested but does agree that it's somehow better than Harry. And if you want to go back to where I'm sort of calling Weston a bad guy fundamentally, Sam puts the finger on what is Weston's view of Harry. Harry is subhuman to Weston. Therefore, anything that they did to him or would have done to him is inconsequential. He doesn't count. Now, he does maybe feel a little weird about potentially harming Ransom because in his mind, Ransom does count. How do you count as a person to Weston, do you think?
Something that someone he can use.
Well, he definitely wants to use him, but I think that there's something about, the intelligence or the background of Ransom that at least qualifies him as being a person, which means depending on how smart you are or aren't, or where you come from or what you do, to somebody like Weston, you are less than a person.
Mhm.
And I just, point that out as one more piece of trying to figure out what kind of guy, no matter how smart he is, what kind of guy Weston is.
I think because of his intellectual abilities, I'm talking about Ransom,
Yeah,
as they experiment on him, whatever this is going to be, he would be much more articulate about reporting what he was experiencing, whereas Harry was just flat out scared. And
sure.
he wouldn't have very helpful feedback
Right.
whenever the experiment was over.
And so they've had this discussion, this kind of argument with each other, but in front of Ransom, because basically they think he's still unconscious. And Ransom's he hasn't understood everything, but he's understood enough. And that whatever manner he was able to convince himself earlier that everything was okay and people like him would never do something terrible or wicked. Well, he knows now. So what's Ransom's last ditch plan?
Recognizing the difference in intellect between the two. And since they are pleased to have someone with Ransom's capability, suggests that they intend to bring him back to Earth. We know that he's going to go off into space, and it would appear that his two captors to be intend to bring him back.
I think we could.
And
infer that.
that's why the difference in intellect, I think, is so important.
And poor Ransom certainly doesn't know that yet. And he's got to think that his situation is pretty dire and desperate. So clearly there's some kind of experiment going on, but he has no idea what it is. But I think Ransom has sort of figured out my only chance is to run. This is not only worse than I thought it was, this is about as bad as it gets.
Yeah.
And I think he has every reason to believe at this point these guys are going to kill him. So what happens?
He runs.
He makes a run for it. He's not a big man. He's not a strong man. He's already tired and he's been drugged, but he's going to make a wild last ditch effort to escape. He even talks about like using his arms and legs with a ferocity he didn't believe he was capable of. And what happens?
Well, while he's working on the bolts to open the door, someone comes up and clobbers him over the head.
This close. He feels the night breeze and bam, it all goes black and they've got him. So it does end on a cliffhanger. The cliffhanger is now that Ransom has realized these are two bad guys and I am in their clutches. He had one shot to escape. He came within an inch and now he's caught and all is darkness again. So, not a ton of science fiction yet, just sort of creepy, moody atmosphere and a couple of very intelligent, but apparently very wicked men who now have our poor Cambridge Dawn in their clutches. And that's kind of where chapter 2 winds up. So I would like us to be able to get more into the story for next time. So how far would you like to go?
Maybe 3 chapters this time. Do that.
I'm going to suggest we read at least to chapter 7. And we could go further. It's not as long as you think it is. Doing 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 is going to be about as long as a Fearfully and Wonderfully chapter. It's going to go pretty quick, and the pages, some of these chapters are only like 2.5, 3 pages. But I think if we can go that far, stuff is going to start to happen, and there's going to be stuff for us to talk about. Are we okay in trying that much, or should we cut it back?
No, that's fine.
All right.
You say through 7?
Yeah,
Up
through
to
7.
8?
So,
Okay.
correct. So 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And it's only.
Well, it's pretty easy.
It's like 22
reading.
pages.
I got so caught up in the book that I'm on chapter 16.
No wonder he is going into outer space.
Exactly. All right. Well, but there's going to be some good stuff for us to talk about, whether you've read first or not, once we get into a couple of these coming chapters. So let's read all the way to the beginning of chapter 8. And we'll get back together next time and we'll have some good stuff to talk about that apparently, according to Tom, involves outer space. But we don't know yet. So maybe he's wrong. But he's probably right.
Yeah.
Okay, we good?
Question,
Yeah.
did you say to the end of chapter 7 or the end of
Yes.
chapter 8?
To the end of chapter 7,
Okay,
to the
gotcha.
beginning of chapter
Okay. Gotcha.
8. Okay, we good?
Yeah.
Yes,
Well, thank you very much.
thank you.
Okay,
Hey,
thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.